It is I. I'm back from the pits of hell, and the Pumpkin King will turn this entire world into a haunted pumpkin patch. No one can stop me, not even you, heroes.
That darn Pumpkin King. He talked right through my drop. What the heck? This video here, I'm going to show you how to make the Pumpkin King. And maybe you can challenge your players with this Pit Lord. I'm going to start with a 2-inch fender washer because I want this Titan from the pits to be massive. I'm going to do a little stonework along with some ground to give the base interesting visual qualities. And then I'm going to start by using some craft dowels, breaking them a bit in the middle for knees, and attaching a piece of scrap doweling for the pelvis. And then I grab a piece of XPS foam and begin to carve it for the chest. A couple more pieces of doweling bent for the arms, some scrap pieces of wood for the hands, and then I trim the many little pieces out for his fingertips, all the while using hot glue. I'll hot glue his arm in place, a couple of clavicles also out of the doweling. I want the Pumpkin King to be holding on to his sword, the Pumpkin Carver. It's going to be a massive rusty blade, trimming out with cardstock, and then along the back edge 2 pieces to give the sword a little texture and visual interest. I'm going to take a piece of dowel, split it very carefully, and slide the blade in almost like a real sword. And then a little bit of a glued wrap around just to secure the blade onto the handle. Then I'll glue the sword into the hand and add more fingertips so that it looks like the Pumpkin King is holding on to his trusty weapon. And at this point, the arms were massive and the legs were just too short. I had always pictured him a long, gangly type demon, and so these small legs would not do. Let's go bigger. This time, untrimmed pieces of the craft doweling would serve as his legs. And this figure, although I didn't plan on him being this big, was going to tower over everything on the table. I found that I didn't like the arm positioning, so I pulled them off and reworked the positioning. And then I grabbed my craft rope because I wanted the Pumpkin King to look as though his body was made from the vines of the pumpkin patch, like he grew from the ground. So I unravel the craft rope and I take pieces of it and wrap it around the limbs of the Pumpkin King. And this makes it look as though his arms and legs and later his torso are actually made from the combined vines of a pumpkin patch. And it is an incredible look, and I'm super pleased with how it turned out. Here I'm using little bits of the doweling to give the Pumpkin King some gnarled toes so that his feet can keep him aloft. And then using that rope, I use 2 pieces per limb. I glue one to the front and wrap around, and then I glue one to the back of the hand and counter wrap it along the doweling. And this provides a really great vine-like effect. And of course, the same process is used for his legs as well. Later, I'm going to go back in with a watered down PVA glue and water mixture, about 50-50, and I'm going to paint the entire figure, the limbs most especially. And this is going to strengthen that rope and bind it to the doweling used for the limbs, and just give the entire character a bit more strength and sturdiness, and give me a better surface to paint and texture. Once the limbs have been wrapped in the rope, I move on to the spine, the pelvis, and then I move on to my rib cage area. I'm going to use this tiny bit of foam here that I've given a rough carve to add the bulk of his chest, but you really won't see any of the foam because I'm going to go back over with these strands of rope, and these rope are going to lay in position of his ribs, and it's going to give the illusion of the vines having created this torso, this rib cage, and the carved out areas are going to be covered in paint and shadow. It's going to come out really nice. With the torso now given the vine treatment, I'm going to reattach some new clavicles using the doweling, and then finally I get to glue the arms back onto the figure. And at this point, the Pumpkin King is really coming together. I can sense his evil upon my table, and I'm getting excited. Oh man, what a great project this ended up being. I wanted to take my newfound love of miniatures and then combine them with my constant love of terrain making, and I just fell in love with this project. So now that we've got a body all assembled, it's time to outfit our Pumpkin King with some armor and clothing. I turned to some thin cardstock and I carve or cut a little jack-o'-lantern-esque breastplate. I have to take it back to the figure, resize it, reshape it, but don't worry, YouTube, we're going to get it looking just right, I promise. After measuring what I had against the actual figure, I decided to try a different method. I trimmed my jack-o'-lantern-esque breastplate off and decided to attach straps and a back plate instead. And this way I had more control over the size and shape. And there's Ren helping me out. Careful, Ren. The Pumpkin King takes no prisoners. Just kidding. No birds were harmed in the making of this video. The Pumpkin King continues to grow in power as he's anointed with his armor. Are you afraid yet, YouTube? You should be. I'm a goof. I've done this many times throughout the project, but this craft rope does get a little frayed, so every once in a while I'll take my scissors and clean him up a little bit. At this point I wanted more armor. I like the asymmetrical shoulder pad look, and I thought that would work great for him, but I also wanted him to have this gnarly looking cape, and so I turned to my cheesecloth, the same material I used in my ship build for my sails, and I cut a nice thin strip, and I thought I could wrap it around his shoulders to give this really cool look. But before I did that, let's do the cape part. Same material, but with the help of hot glue, I'm gonna bind it on the top, and this is gonna give the rest of the cape these really cool dramatic folds. Once I've got the folds looking the way I want, I hot glue to the back. With the cape placed on the back, it's time to wrap the other part of the cape, the shouldery cowl part. Boy, I'm messing up that terminology, I'm sure of it. But I'm gonna wrap that around his shoulders. And this is gonna hide where I glued the cape on and make it look like a single piece. In keeping with the jack-o'-lantern theme for the Pumpkin King's armor, I do a cool looking jack-o'-lantern shoulder plate and glue it to the side, his non-sword hand. Now, I had got a new material, and one day I sat on the couch and sculpted the head. It's this modeling foam. It's in the cosplay section at Michael's, and it's basically a soft, very foamy-esque. It's not clay, but it acts like it. And I sat down while I was watching TV, and I sculpted what is now the Pumpkin King's head. It was the first time I had ever used the material, and I liked it. I'm going to recommend that you give it a go. On the top of his head, I added what looks like the top cap of a carved jack-o'-lantern, and I added some twisted rope like it was the stem of a very large pumpkin. Glued his head into place, and then I went about tattering his cape so that it looked as though he was fresh from the grave. His arms looked a little undecorated at this point, and I thought, man, this really cool ripped kind of shroud material wrapped up in his hand would look amazing. So I cut a strip, hot glued, wrapped it, and boy, it looked good. And it also covered up my lack of detail on his palms. Another addition I made was to get some decorative chain from Hobby Lobby or Michael's. I'm not sure where exactly this one came from, but I thought it'd be cool to have some chains decorating his armor. So I glue a couple to the corner of that shoulder and have them disappear into his back plate beneath the cape. It adds a really cool, subtle touch. You know what? No, not so subtle. A very cool Chains of Hell kind of motif and touch to the figure. It's simple in use, but super effective visually. If I had one argument, it was that I didn't use enough chain. I could have found some other places, and that would have worked well. And the sword arm needed a little something more. So I decided to do a fancy bracer type piece of armor, again with a pumpkin motif. I've got the shape drawn out, and then I trace that on another piece with a pumpkin and a little Celtic knot, and then very carefully cut those out and glue them to the first piece, and it gives a raised look to the bracer, which is going to take paint and texture very well. It ends up looking really good on his sword arm. It was worth the extra effort. Finally, we're getting to close to the finishing steps. I hit the base with some PVA and flock with sand, and then I take him outside and hit him with a Zenithal primer. That is, I base him in black and then dust him along the top with white. And this is going to mimic like the moonlight hitting him and give the paint a very subtle but interesting look. And then now it's on to painting, and boy, I'm excited. I am so pumped with how the Pumpkin King turned out. I'm gonna hit those stones he's standing on with the granite gray. I'm gonna hit this ground with a Mississippi mud. We're not reinventing the wheel here, everybody. Just using the colors that I'm comfortable with and colors that I think are gonna look great. I go back in and I hit his withered, vined body with a burnt sienna brown. It's going to give the vines a nice dark look. For the bandages on his arm and his cape, I'm going to paint those a khaki color and just do the best I can. It's hard to get all the little bits, nooks, and crannies of this cheesecloth, but I do a pretty good job, and that's why we based it with the Zenithal, the black with the white. It's going to hide any unpainted areas for us, so don't stress too much. Nothing crazy here. His armor, the shoulder, the bracer, the chest piece, and the blade of his sword are all getting a gunmetal gray. I also give the chains a little brush with the gunmetal gray as well. I got lucky and bought chains that were already black, plus they got primed with that Zenithal technique. And then purchased specifically for this project Americana's Jack-o'-lantern orange. I'm not happy with this paint. Americana, what are you doing? And the coverage was awful. I don't know if that's because I primed him with a dark color, but I had to go over the head 3 different times. I still didn't get the full orange color that I wanted, but he is like a rotten pumpkin man, so, you know, a darker orange didn't ruin the figure. It worked. I still love the way he turned out. But that orange was 3 different coats. And you've all seen my recent homemade black wash. It's way too dark. I didn't want a chance ruining this beautiful figure, so I grabbed my Citadel Nun Oil, which is their professional black wash, and I just went over and hit the whole darn thing with this black wash. This is going to get into all the dark crevices, the nooks, the crannies. It's going to make that rope look like vines. Oh, it just pops. It gets into all the little bits of the cheesecloth, makes it look like a dark shroud. Just amazing. And then it highlights the dark areas, the lines in the head, and really emphasizes that evil face sculpt that I gave him. Incredible. I love washes. Talent in a bottle, like they say. I love it. With the wash dried, I wanted to go back in and highlight some of the raised parts of his monstrous pumpkin face. So on the brows, underneath the eyes, around the mouth, and some of the larger parts of his gourd head, I'm going to go back in with that jack-o'-lantern orange and just highlight and give that monstrous pumpkin head a nice punch of color again. Then I went back in with the khaki and just dry brushed those limbs. I wanted that viney texture to just pop. And the dry brush just did the trick. Then I went back with his shroud, his bandage, his cape, and dry brushed it just to make it pop again, so those deep dark shadows from the Nuln Oil stayed, but then I picked back up that color. And then because I was on this highlighting kick, I thought, let's do the armor too. So around the edges and points of interest on the armor, I went back and I highlighted with the silver. This ended up really looking good and making all that really cool Pumpkin Man flavored armor just jump at you. So I turned to a glow-in-the-dark yellow paint to fill in the Pumpkin King's eyes and his mouth. I thought this would be a really cool effect and make him look like a lit-up jack-o'-lantern. It's another very light paint. It has a very hard time painting over the orange. It took many, many coats, and I still didn't quite get the richness of color that I wanted. But the effect still looks pretty cool, and when you put a lot of light on that paint and then shut the light down, oh man, his eyes and mouth light up like a jack-o'-lantern. It's fantastic. At this point, I decided to flock the ground with my turf, the shredded green, and then I thought it'd look really cool to give his body some of the same treatment. So where the limbs are bare or a little less covered by the rope, I go in and I dab with some white PVA glue and hit it with that green flock. And then I want to dirty him up a little bit. And I've got this Army Painter rust effect. And I pulled that out and I just hit all his armor and sword with the rust effect. And then I also use a blood effect. I put some blood on his fingertips and smear it across the blade of his sword to make him look like he's just gotten done reaping several people who have dared to stand against him. And then every good pit lord needs some minions, so I've got some gibbering, jabbering pumpkin jack-o'-lantern minions that I did using the rope and some XPS foam. And now we've got our setup. The Pumpkin King has risen from the grave, and he's set to turn the entire world into his haunted pumpkin patch, and only our brave heroes can stand against him. I love this project. Thank you so much for watching. Like each other, love each other, and craft on. Oh, and don't forget to hit subscribe, like, and comment. I love you guys. Bye-bye.